Buongiorno a tutte, buongiorno a tutti. È un piacere, un grande piacere introdurre l'amico e collega Alan Francis. Alan Francis è attualmente professore emerito al Dipartimento di Psichiatria e Scienze Comportamentali della Duke University School of Medicine di Durham, nella Carolina del Nord, ed è tra l'altro questa università, questa facoltà di medicina è quella che lui stesso ha diretto per tantissimi anni. Alan Francis è autore ed è coautore di tantissimi, centinaia di importanti articoli specialistici di diversi volumi accademici e negli ultimi anni si è dato anche a un'attività pubblicistica, scrive frequentemente su Huffington Post, su Psychology Today e su Educational Update. È sicuramente una delle voci più autorevoli della psichiatria internazionale, senza diciamo ripercorrere un lungo curriculum che non sarebbe qui il caso, però vi ricordo che è stato il coordinatore della quarta edizione del famoso DSM, il manuale diagnostico e statistico dei disturbi mentali dell'American Psychiatric Association, ma è stata anche una delle voci più severe nel criticare la quinta edizione, quella successiva, imputando al DSM quinto, che è uscito nel 2013, una medicalizzazione eccessiva del disagio mentale e, diciamo così, un iperdiagnosticismo non sempre motivato. Quindi diciamo che è un uomo capace di attraversare e di coordinare una grossa impresa scientifica come il manuale diagnostico dei disturbi mentali dell'American Psychiatric Association, però al tempo stesso, insomma, di segnalare tutta una serie di elementi critici letti anche dalla prospettiva del contesto sociale, oltre che del contesto psicologico e biologico. Ha fatto moltissimi interventi pubblici e accademici, infatti, su dei temi che, non so, forse potremmo provare a riassumere sotto una voce che potrebbe essere usi e abusi della diagnosi in psichiatria. Di Alan Francis sono tradotti in Italia 2 volumi, i cui titoli sono molto significativi. Uno è pubblicato da Bollati Boringhieri e si intitola Primo, non curare chi è normale, contro l'invenzione delle malattie, quindi chiaramente il tema è quello dell'iperdiagnosticismo psichiatrico, e l'altro si intitola La diagnosi in psichiatria, ripensare il DSM-5, è pubblicato da Raffaello Cortina ed è una guida, diciamo così, molto importante, soprattutto per le generazioni più giovani, ai limiti, alle luci e alle oscurità del processo diagnostico, soprattutto in relazione, diciamo così, alla diagnostica corrente, che è quella del DSM-5. Poi c'è un terzo volume che è stato tradotto in italiano, l'ha pubblicato anche questo Bollati Boringhieri, e si intitola Il crepuscolo di una nazione, l'America di Trump all'esame di uno psichiatra. Non si tratta, come ingannevolmente potrebbe far pensare il titolo, di un libro su Trump e le sue vere o presunte patologie psichiatriche. In realtà si tratta di un testo in cui Francis si apre a riflessioni che certamente partono sempre dal suo background psichiatrico, però diventano più sociali, più politiche e abbracciano, diciamo così, dall'individualità di un possibile paziente, diciamo una riflessione su un paziente collettivo, cioè sulla psiche non di un uomo ma di una nazione e in generale sulla crisi e sulla problematicità dello spirito democratico, diciamo così, in questo inizio di millennio. Cioè Alan Francis sembra dirci che è la società, insomma, oggi il malato più grave da curare, e questa sua riflessione naturalmente è molto collegata alla riflessione sul tema del dopo che gli è stata richiesta e che tra poco ascolterete. Per Alan Francis parlare del dopo è per esempio raccontare Darwin come un grande psicologo, studioso dell'evoluzione e delle relazioni tra gli individui alla luce, diciamo così, del grande contenitore evoluzionista, ma è anche raccontare di Greta Thunberg come voce lucida, importante, ma non ascoltata. Parlare del dopo per Alan Francis è parlare di sviluppo del pianeta, di sovrappopolazione, di mancanza di risorse, di esasperazione dei consumi e ovviamente di crisi ecologica e di crisi climatica, ma anche, venendo a temi molto più recenti, ai problemi psicologici, sociali e sanitari della negazione, per esempio, del Covid da parte delle persone Novax e della perdita, diciamo così, in generale della fiducia nella scienza. Quindi lo ascolteremo alla luce di tutte queste considerazioni che ho ovviamente brevemente elencato, porre una sorta di domanda impossibile, cioè come è possibile che l'essere umano nel corso del suo sviluppo sia stato capace di essere al tempo stesso così intelligente, diciamo, da inventare la scienza, la medicina e le arti, ma anche così stupido da rendere questo pianeta, il suo pianeta, sempre più invivibile. E così, diciamo, concluderà prospettandoci per questo dopo 3 scenari che dirà uno è bello, uno è brutto e l'altro è cattivo. Quindi con una certa amarezza per la condizione del pianeta e con sicuramente molto pessimismo per il destino dell'umanità, però Alan Francis ci infonde anche un tema di entusiasmo e di speranza, e dunque non resta che ascoltarlo, soprattutto ascoltare il suo invito a fare, diciamo, ciascuno di noi la propria parte. Grazie e buon ascolto.
After 300 years of the most successful evolutionary course of any biological creature in the 4 billion years of life on Earth, our species is now poised at the edge of self-destruction. This may seem kind of like a paradox. Why is it that the most successful species is now perhaps going to make itself extinct in a very short period of time? But actually, both our success and our failure, both of these make perfect sense. The success of our species is dependent on the fact that we're very clever creatures. The failure of our species depends on the fact that in the history of the world, very few species have lasted more than 1 million years. So we've already run a fair amount of our course. And the fact that we're self-destructing so quickly compared to other species is perhaps the reward of our success. The typical course for species is a very slow beginning, then an exponentially increasing growth, the achievement of tremendous success evolutionarily speaking, and then a sudden crash as the species runs out of resources, uses up its supplies, and sometimes drowns in its own filth. Our species has followed this course much quicker than most because we're so smart and so technologically proficient, and also because we've been so lucky up until this point that the climate of the last 12,000 years has been the most stable of any climate on Earth for perhaps the last 50 million years. So we've been living in a bubble of good climate that we're about to ruin, and we'll be discussing that a lot more as we go along. The basic problem facing us, the cause of our existential challenge, is overpopulation. That in the history of humanity from 300,000 years until about 11 or 12,000 years ago, the total population growth never exceeded about 5 to 10 million people. From the time of the development of agriculture till now, this very short 11,000 years, the population of the Earth has increased from perhaps 10 million to 7.5 billion. And the time course of that is fascinating. So that we went from having 5 million people 10,000 years ago to having 300,000 people at the time of the birth of Jesus Christ. It took 10, 11,000 years to go from 5 million to 300 million. We went from 300 million people to 1 billion people in 1,800 more years. Around 1800, we first reached the milestone of 1 billion people. It then took us just 123 years to double that, to go from 1 billion to 2 billion. And why did that happen? The combination of fossil fuels, the widespread use of fossil fuels began around 1800, and also the Industrial Revolution. Since 1920, when we got to 2 billion. We've gone from 2 billion to 7.5 billion, and we're adding another billion of population approximately every 15 years. So there's been this sudden exponential population growth. It's unclear where this will continue. The best predictions are about 10 billion at the end of this century, but the UN is so uncertain in its predictions that it could be as much as 20 billion or as few as 3 billion in the next 100 or so years, depending on whether we gain control over our population. It may expand double to what it was expected to 20 billion people, or if there's a collapse. If because of overpopulation, we run out of food, we run out of water, nuclear wars ensue, the population could undergo a very rapid collapse. Any rational person looking at this progression of population and understanding the impact this has on carbon dioxide would be saying that we face an existential threat, and that if we don't come together as a world to figure out a way to avoid continuing overpopulation, to avoid the carbon dioxide changes that result from that and from increased consumption, we're going to have an absolute disaster. It's staring us in the face. So far, as Greta Thunberg puts it so articulately, people have gone blah, 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 blah. We've had conferences going back now almost 20 years discussing ways to avoid this. Politicians talk, and there's really no action that's substantively going to make a difference in what's an existentially disastrous course for the future. We're not controlling population much better than we would have if we'd made real policy to do so. We certainly are not controlling the carbon dioxide, and the climate disasters are happening all around us. Now, we're this really smart creature. Why is it that we're so smart in some ways and so stupid in others? Why is it that we are able to master mathematics and physics and chemistry, that we're able to plumb the universe and understand its past, understand our own DNA composition? And we can't do the amazingly complicated things, but we can't do the simplest thing in the world, or seemingly the simplest thing in the world, and that is control our population and figure out a way to not destroy our climate, to not make our Earth unlivable. Why that paradox? Why that mystery? Why can such a smart creature be acting in such a very stupid way? Well, the secret to this really goes back to Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin was the greatest psychologist who ever lived. Approximately a year after he returned from the Beagle in 1837, he wrote a marginal note in his diaries, his notebooks, that summed up the most important insight in the history of psychology. He said, if we want to understand human psychology, study baboons, not the philosophers. That he understood that the human psychological endowment is just as much an inheritance from our animal past as our bodies are. We look like primates in the way our bodies are conformed, and our brains are wired in such a way that our behaviors very much reproduce primate behaviors. So that what controls us in much of our actions are the behavioral attributes that were essential for survival of primates going back 40 million years. Now, some of these are obviously wonderful instincts we have, otherwise they wouldn't have worked so well during this period of time. But some of what's built into our unconscious, some of what makes us behave the way we behave, which was so adaptive to get us to this point, is now dangerous in the next steps we take. Because much of what we do without thinking, we do based on instinct. Now, what do I mean by this? Most basically, our DNA wants to reproduce itself. DNA cares less about us and more about reproducing itself. And so babies are cute, sex is fun, and no creature, actually, since the history of evolution, going back these 4 billion years, has been very good at stopping DNA reproduction. We're all very good at reproducing DNA. We're not very good at putting on the brakes. And what this means is that most species overpopulate, that they wind up being as successful as they are. The more successful they are, the more they overpopulate. And once they overpopulate, they crash. This has happened over and over again with species. It's happened over and over again with human civilizations. It's interesting that if you look at the garbage heaps of different civilizations going back the last 5,000 years, the most garbage, which means the most building, the most stuff, the most production, happens just before a crash. A civilization reaches its peak and then crashes. Species reach their peak and then crash. And it's very, very likely that we're reaching our peak, our population peak, on a very small pebble of a planet that has no other frontiers for us to explore in a realistic way. Space is not going to save our species. That we may have reached our peak, and unless we can control our population and our consumption, two very difficult things to control because of the way we're wired, that we're heading towards that crash. Everything is pointing in two different directions. So the birth rates in developed countries have dropped. Even the Catholic countries have dropped from 4, 5, 6 over the last century to replacement or below replacement. We still have enormously high birth rates in Africa and parts of Southeast Asia. And that accounts for this tremendous risk of even more overpopulation in the future. And we have religious beliefs that were tied to the needs of 20,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, when having more children made sense, where the tribes were small and survival depended on populating the earth. The religious beliefs that are tied to children being of great value are at this point disastrous because more children lead to the crash that's going to inevitably follow from the overpopulation and the climate damage that it causes. So certain Orthodox religions, whether they're Christian or Jewish or Islamic, encourage a continued family lack of planning, leading to 7, 8, 9 children with disastrous consequences. It's disastrous that we're not providing contraception around the world. It's disastrous that we're having futile battles about abortion in the United States. That we will have to gain control over population if we are to survive as a species. Along with this, we have to get control of consumption. But this brings in a second built-in DNA influenced behavior pattern that's inherent in human nature, and that's greed. So in the history of humanity, going back these last 300,000 years, it made tremendous sense to be greedy, because those who were able to accumulate as much as possible in terms of resources were likely to survive. Those who weren't greedy were likely to be wiped out during the next famine. That greed now is tremendously destructive to the species as a whole, but so far uncontrollable. And the greediest people are the ones usually who have the most. So we have tremendous inequality within the developed countries. We have tremendous inequality between the developed countries and the less developed countries. The consumption levels are ridiculously high amongst the top 1, 2, 3% of the population, ridiculously low for 60 or 70% of the world's population. If we're going to continue to consume at the rate each person consumes, especially as the population continues to increase, we will use up all the resources and contaminate our environment in a way that's irrevocable. And so we have to do two things that so far have been impossible to most species, all species, and so far impossible to us as smart as we are. We have to control the population growth, and we have to control our greed and the need for each person to consume as much as they possibly can consume, because there's just not that much left. A third built-in evolutionary problem is that humans are not good at waste management. That we were programmed for behaviors that worked for hunters and gatherers, where dealing with waste was simple as walking away the next day. That the agricultural revolution with sedentary lifestyles led to a tremendous accumulation of waste. One of the recurrent symbols for this is London being drowned in horseshit during the late 1800s, and everyone worrying about how it could survive as a city. And the example of the technology of automobiles solving that problem is often given as a metaphor for what we can do with our climate change now, although it's a not very good metaphor because cars solved the horseshit problem but created their own carbon dioxide problem. In general, we don't consider how we're going to deal with the waste we produce. We don't tax the oil companies and industrial companies with what should be an escrow fund to take care of the waste they leave behind. That the enormous long-term costs to the environment are never part of the day-to-day reckoning of price. That makes the resources we use now and waste now too cheap, makes it too easy to use things now, to price things at a level that makes their consumption highly desirable without thinking about the impact that this will have on our children and our grandchildren. Whenever we buy a product, we should be paying for how do we do the waste management for this product so it doesn't destroy the air, destroy the seas. The next inbuilt problem that Darwin was also very aware of is tribalism. In a world in which small groups cooperating with one another do much better than groups that don't cooperate well or don't form groups, the groups win. And tribalism, loyalty to the people within your group, cooperation amongst human beings, man being a social animal, was a secret to our survival during these last 300,000 years. But tribalism is very dangerous when the world's too crowded. At this point, we should be seeing the whole of the human species as one tribe, that we face existential enemies in the form of virus, existential enemies in the form of climate change. And unless we as a group, as the human species, come together and deal with pandemics as a whole, deal with climate change as a whole, if we fight amongst each other, we make things much worse. And it's exactly what we're doing. The disastrous response to COVID illustrates how far we have to go to understanding that we're one human race, that we're not a bunch of different nations, we're not a bunch of different tribes, and that we're going to survive together or we're going to destroy each other to the extent in which we can cooperate as a species, not as individual countries, individual races, individual religions. This is very much built into how we function, that the oxytocin, which is the hormone that helps to create the mother-love relationship between child and mother, also creates the tribal feelings, brings together attraction amongst people who are beloved. But that same oxytocin stimulates aggression to strangers. And so we have this inbuilt tendency when there's a threat to blame someone else, to blame the US, to blame China, and China to blame the US, rather than to understand that at this point, the fates of all of humanity, all of us are together in the same boat. And if one group sinks, we will all sink. And if we wind up fighting nuclear wars over who's going to get the last supply of oil or of water, it's going to destroy the planet as a whole, not just individuals. And the last thing is the quality of denial. So that the ability of humans not to see what's right in front of their face is incredible. And this was adaptive again in a world in which survival was always terribly unsure. It was very important that people not always be thinking about the fact that I might be dead tomorrow, that a tiger might eat me up, I may not have food tomorrow. That to preserve hope, it's part of humanity to be resilient and to not face how terrible things can be. That's been tremendously adaptive up to this point. It's now tremendously dangerous. If we deny the reality of climate change, when people deny the reality of COVID and won't take vaccines, that this is terrifically and obviously self-destructive, walking over the cliff. And so far, that denial is so built into human nature that unless we're able to confront it and have people realize that these are real threats, that the virus is a real threat, that climate change is a real threat, that we have to act and not act tribally, but act together, we will never be able to accomplish the maintenance of our current society, its survival into the future. Which brings us to the future. And briefly, I think there are three possible outcomes of where we are now. There's the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good would be that we come together, we reduce our intertribal rivalry, see our species as one tribe. we reduce our tendency to deny the risks of the future. We worry about our children and our grandchildren, and we make radical changes in how we're dealing with the problems of the world, especially climate. And certainly there are going to be many more pandemics, and we deal with them in a much more rational way. That would be the good. Odds of that are not that great. People hope that there'll be technological changes for climate, that maybe nuclear fusion or sustainable energy sources, or carbon capture or throwing sulfur into the environment may solve the problem. I would not be betting on that. I'd be taking out an insurance policy that we're going to have to change our worldwide behaviors dramatically, and now. No more coal plants. We have to reduce consumption, and we have to control population now if we are to survive as a species. The bad, so we have the good. The good would be that we come together and we find technological solutions. The bad would be that there's a crash. That we're beginning to see it now with fires everywhere, record temperatures everywhere, no water to drink in Yemen, and a civil war, at least partly caused by overpopulation and no resources. That we will have a kind of dramatic exponential increase of all the current world problems, to the point where millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions, and maybe billions of people die through the effects of climate change, pandemics, and the wars that will undoubtedly follow in the chaotic aftermath of all of this. The good news scenario within the bad scenario is that perhaps as more and more disasters happen, people will become more alert. We're beginning to see some of that already as the world's on fire and as the pandemics rage. The people are becoming more aware of the fact that we need to join together in climate change, that we need to have better policies in terms of dealing with pandemic on a worldwide rather than national basis, that we might lose millions, tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of people between now and wising up, but that we wise up in time to be able to preserve what's left. So that's a horrible thought. It's a tragic thought. Think about hundreds of millions of people dying because we were blind now. We could take steps now to save them, and we haven't done it. But it's a thought that's reassuring in the sense that it might be hard for us to wipe ourselves out altogether, that there will be a retrenchment, a regrouping, that civilizations are born and die and then born again, and that humanity will survive even though we're tremendously stupid in this period. The really ugly possibility, but it's not impossible, is that we destroy our civilization and maybe even create the extinction of the species. It's too horrible to think about, but it's better to think about it than just walk off the cliff and have it happen. And I think it's tremendously stupid for us and selfish for us to not consider the consequences of every current action now on not just our children, but also our grandchildren, their children, and the subsequent generations that we hope will continue to bring humanity into the future. And so the only hope in this is that things get bad enough now that we wake up before it's too late. And certainly the alarm bells are ringing all over the world. And the question is whether the leaders of the world are able to respond to the long-term interests of mankind, or whether they continue to just deal with the short-term interests of their own selfish political futures or of their country. And at this point, there's no reason. The COVID pandemic gives us no reason to be optimistic about the future. Our responses to climate change give us no reason to be optimistic about the future. But we have to remain optimistic. We have to remain hopeful. We can't afford to give up. And as Edmund Burke said, that there's no greater mistake than to do nothing because each person felt they could do just a little. So I think all of us have a responsibility to do our best to work towards a more rational world, and people stop denying the obvious facts of life, where people start taking action based on the needs of our children and grandchildren, where we face the risks and do the things now that will make for a reasonable future for humanity on this very fragile planet. On that note that's mostly pessimistic but slightly hopeful, that maybe we're smart enough and generous enough in spirit to try to save this planet for our species and for our children and our grandchildren. Thank you very much.